Welcome back, everyone. A lot of things happened since the last firmware video, and I thought it was time for a new one. On one hand, the 5.2 firmware is finally released, and on the other hand, I've also learned a lot of things. Some things that I said the first time weren't fully accurate. This video should once and for all help everybody update firmware on their VESCs. What I'm going to go through in this video is I'll give you some introduction about the VESC tool and firmware in general. Then I'll show you what you need to do to prepare for the firmware update. Then perform the firmware update. I'll give you all the details on that. And then discuss some common problems and solutions. To start out, the VESC tool and firmware are basically a tool for your PC. That's the VESC tool. And the firmware that runs on your VESC. The tool is completely separate from the firmware. And if you download a new tool, you also, in most cases, need a new version of the firmware because the tool and the firmware, they are dependent on each other, and some changes in the tool are not compatible with older firmwares and vice versa. So that's why it's important to have the right combination of tool and firmware. Now, the act of uploading firmware, that's basically when you take the VESC tool and you use it to load firmware onto your VESC. And that's what we're going to go through today. To update your firmware, you want to be prepared. First, you want to find out which firmware you have. Then you want to make a backup of your configuration. Then you want to download the latest VESC tool and the matching firmware. Let's start the tool. I'm running the tool on Linux, but if you do the same thing on Windows, it makes no difference. Let's connect to our VESC. I'm connecting to it over Bluetooth, but you can do it over USB. It makes no difference. I'll just connect to the last connection that I had. And hopefully, there we go. All right, so now you can go to the firmware tab here, and it tells me what I've got. So I've got the beta 18 of the firmware 5.2. But we're going to download the latest version, which is the production version, the release version of 5.2. Now we know what firmware we have. The next step is to make a backup of your configuration. And the VESC tool makes it really easy for you. Here, conf backup, backup configuration, done. If for some reason you have a VESC tool that doesn't match your firmware, then you will not be able to do this. You will get an error that says something like deserializing motor configuration failed, and that basically means you cannot save your configuration. It's not the end of the world. If you do have the right version of the tool, then use that to create the backup. But if you can't create a backup, I'll show you how to get around that. It's also no problem. Now, all we have to do is download the latest VESC tool. To get the latest VESC tool, you go to vescproject.com, and there is the tool here, and now you can download it. It's up to you which version you want to purchase, or if you want to use the free one. They are all the same, but obviously it would be nice to support the project a little bit. So this is up to you. You download it. If you've previously purchased it, you get 6 months to download new versions. So I've already purchased mine, so I will just log in and download it and unpack it on my computer. So for me, the VESC tool is here in this location. This is the new version. Okay, so here's our new tool. Let's go and do the update. If you have a VESC that's listed in here, it should automatically give you the compatible versions that you'll be able to use. Now, I expected the cheap Fokker version 1.0 to be included here, but it is missing. So probably not a big deal because pretty much nobody has version 1.0 yet, but I'm a little disappointed that I don't see it in here. For us, this doesn't really matter. I will connect to my fun wheel. Alright, it warns me that I have test firmware. Yep, that's expected. I was running beta versions till now. And now when I go to the firmware tab, it doesn't show any more hardware available here because there's nothing in the included list of firmwares that the VESC tool includes that matches my hardware, so it refuses to show me anything. So I need a custom file, which is fine. We will go here, we will go to my directory where I have a bunch of firmwares. This is the version that you want. It's labeled CFOC v0.9 vanilla. This one doesn't have any additional features. I'm using one with some buzzer and LED pins, but this is the vanilla version I'm going to load now. So I select that file. The file extension has to be .bin. The file name also has to start with either VESC underscore or BLDC underscore. Otherwise, you will not be able to even load it into this tool. Now we're going to start it. And because I'm using Bluetooth, it's going to take a fairly long time, about 10 times as long as using USB, but let's go and accelerate it. If you are using Bluetooth, and if for any reason the upload gets interrupted, no need to freak out. The VESC seems to be very robust to not getting bricked during doing this. I've had my son once jump on the one wheel and just ride off while I was updating firmware, and it was fine afterwards. I just had to power cycle it and reconnect to it. Actually, it freaked my PC out more than it freaked out the VESC firmware. I had to disable and re-enable Bluetooth in order for it to be able to reconnect. If you can use USB because your VESC is still on the bench, then it's much faster using USB. But if you would need to loosen a whole bunch of screws to get to it, to connect to USB, it's probably easier to just use Bluetooth like I'm doing right now. And we are done. So now, as this dialog tells you, you need to wait 10 seconds. I don't know why they say unplugging power. I don't know why anybody would do that. You don't need to power cycle your VESC. You just wait for it to restart. If you have it on the bench, you will see the LEDs coming up for it booting. Otherwise, you just wait 10-20 seconds. Then you should be able to reconnect by just using the same reconnect last connection. And there we go. We are connected. We have firmware 5.2 and it no longer says beta, so it looks like it worked. Now, if for some reason it still tells you the exact same version as before the firmware update, then there is a 99% chance that it failed because you need a new bootloader. And uploading a new bootloader is just as easy as uploading firmware. All you have to do is you go here in this bootloader tab, you pick the generic one, and I know that the generic one works for the cheap Fokker, it works for the BalancePro. I don't have any experience with other VESCs, but I'm assuming it works with most of them. So you just load the generic one, you hit this button here, and it tells you it will attempt to upload a bootloader. You said yes. I will not do that right now, but this is all you have to do, and then you redo the firmware upload like I've shown you. So we have verified the firmware version. Now, very important last step is you need to restore your configuration. And this is why it's really crazy that anybody would suggest that you need to power cycle this, or that you would now be able to just walk off and ride away with new firmware. You cannot, because you have lost your configuration. So your VESC is basically a vanilla virgin VESC that has never been configured, and until you either reconfigure it or you restore your configuration, this VESC is not going to work unless you have some default configuration. I don't know what that used to be, some E-skate, some small wheels, I have no idea. But for most users, you always have to restore your configuration to get anything to work. So we're going to say restore configuration, and it does that automatically. It basically goes by the unique ID of your VESC, so it knows where to find it. Now, if you're in the camp of people that don't have a successful backup because you couldn't find the right combination of tools first, or you skipped that step, or you forgot it, not a big deal. Now you basically need to re-detect your motor, you need to do your Hall sensor detection, you need to do your IMU calibration, and for most users, the easiest way to get to a working configuration after having a new firmware and you don't have a backup is you load a motor configuration XML and an app configuration XML that you get from your respective Discord channel. So for the Fun Wheel, there is one. It's called crowdsourced beta 17 or something like that in the config channel of the Discord. And you load both of those, and then you do your motor configuration and Hall sensor detection IMU configuration, and then everything is restored. So this is basically all you need to do. I can go and check that my settings are back, and yes, I see my PID that I have configured before. Everything looks just like I configured it before I uploaded new firmware. So my board is now good to go and I can try it out. Now let's get to the common problems that people face. Number one, your firmware version is unchanged after the firmware update. Basically what happened is the update fails if you don't have the right bootloader installed, and you simply use the VESC tool to update the bootloader too. I've shown you how to do that. So that is problem number one. Number two, you have something like cannot deserialize motor or app configuration. Essentially, you have successfully updated your firmware, but now your VESC tool no longer matches the firmware version, so they don't know how to exchange configurations anymore. The solution is you need to use the appropriate VESC tool version. For example, if I had used the old tool to update the firmware and then reconnected to my VESC, I would have gotten exactly that error. Or if you use the new tool but accidentally pick an old firmware, you would get the exact same error. So make sure you use the right tool and firmware version, and once you've updated to the latest firmware, you also need to use the latest VESC tool. And then the last problem is you've updated your firmware, but now your motor is making funny sounds instead of writing. The underlying issue essentially is that updating the firmware resets your configuration to the defaults, and the solution is you need to restore your configuration if you made a backup beforehand. If you didn't, you gotta just redo your configuration from scratch. All right, that's all I got. I hope it's been helpful.